This is my diversity audit presentation on equitable hiring practices in the social sciences department at Dalton State College. The purpose of this audit is to determine whether or not there are equitable and inclusive hiring and interviewing practices occurring within the Department of Social Sciences, specifically within the political science department. The scope of this diversity audit is intended to investigate whether there are systemic or structural barriers that exist within the department that lead to hiring discrepancies that have occurred. While I imagine that these discrepancies exist throughout the institution, and I would say that is the case given the percentage of minority faculty that are currently employed at the college, I am focusing specifically on the Department of Social Sciences and political science specifically because I am a faculty member within that department and am the coordinator for political science. As such, I have firsthand knowledge regarding how these processes have worked, and I have sat on several search committees within political science and social sciences. So the process that I've chosen to use for this particular audit is that I conducted face-to-face and virtual interviews with members of social science, students that have either been in the social science department or have served on search committees at the college, and upper administration at the college. In addition, I examined and analyzed policies and procedures related to hiring and related to diversity on campus. I examined, analyzed, and did my best to interpret institutional data, including graduation rates, NESE data, and DSC faculty data. And finally, I utilized anecdotal environmental evidence. Now, while this evidence is not necessarily scientific, having been a member of the faculty for the past decade at Dalton State College, I have a lot of anecdotal information regarding interview practices, things that went on search committees that end up being valuable points of information in this conversation. The timeline was a relatively quick one. I conducted interviews and collected data for about the first half or so of the month. I spent about 2 weeks evaluating that data and another week coming up with recommendations based on the data that I had collected. So a summary of my results is as follows. The first result. While it is unquestionably true that we teach a diverse population of students, the college has struggled to enact an institutional commitment to diversity and inclusion. It's important to note that this isn't about open hostility, rather it stems from our inability to recognize the impact that our action or inaction has on our hiring processes and thus on vulnerable populations. The second item is that diversity initiatives, especially those initiatives that are related to hiring and employment, cannot be seen as add-ons. They have to become an integrated part of our institutional culture and infrastructure. If we're unable to do that, we're going to continue to struggle to retain diverse faculty and consequently to retain diverse students. Summary item 3 is that in examining the data and speaking with the upper administration at the college, one thing that may be happening is an inadvertent sort of discouraging of diversity by telling candidates not to focus on color and only focus on merits. This focus on meritocracy sort of ignores the inequities that exist on a systemic and structural level for faculty members of color and assumes that everyone's on a level playing field when there's data and anecdotal evidence that speaks otherwise. Summary item 4 is that minority students seem to feel a deeper connection to the institution when they have faculty and staff who share their backgrounds and experiences as either their support systems or at the very least a part of a broader support system. Representation matters, and it seems to matter to students. So after collecting this data, I made 4 recommendations. The first is that we should reimagine the vision statement and the mission statement as a declarative statement of what can and should be the case about diversity. While our statements mention diversity, none of them offer any substantive pathway to achieve that diversity. 2, there needs to be implicit bias training for all faculty and staff at the institution, but particularly for those who are serving on search committees. One thing that came up over and over and over again was implicit bias. Some of it was a result of the age of the search committees. Search committees on average were about 20 years older than the faculty at large. And some of it had to do with sort of the political culture of the college and the area that we exist in. Third, there needs to be a standardization of hiring practices across the institution. Every department should be following the same policies and procedures when it comes to hiring, and no department should be able to make independent decisions about the process through which they hire people. And finally, I recommend that the college place advocates on each search committee. There should be a diversity advocate on every search committee whose job it is to highlight the areas where diversity could be utilized or where conversations about diversity need to occur. So the roadmap for getting there is a 4-pronged roadmap. First, there needs to be the creation of a diversity committee with institutional backing. We have had ad hoc diversity committees, but they haven't really had any teeth. There needs to be a diversity committee that is backed by the president's office, student affairs, and academic affairs to be successful. 2, there needs to be a comprehensive evaluation of our institutional hiring practices. It's not enough to think that we do things. We have to know exactly what we're doing and the areas for improvement. Third, we need to identify the gendered and racialized language in our materials. Whether it's the places that we're advertising or the words and phrases that we're using to do so, we have to be hyper conscious of how these words, phrases, statements affect the likelihood that minority candidates will apply to our institution. And finally, we need comprehensive review and reevaluation. Diversity is not static, and therefore our diversity processes should not be. There needs to be a consistent and constant review and reevaluation process that is implemented at the departmental and institutional levels. My final reflections sort of stemmed from an article that I read from Mary Beth Gassman, who's a professor of higher education at the University of Pennsylvania. During a panel, she was asked, why aren't college faculties more racially diverse? And her answer was simple, yet deafening. She said, the reason we don't have more faculty of color among college faculty is that we don't want them. We simply don't want them. She was basically acknowledging that for institutions to hire, retain, and train a diverse faculty, there has to be intentionality, right? The process cannot be episodic. There has to be intentional efforts by the institution to continually improve their processes to champion and promote diversity. If Dalton State College can come up with a comprehensive plan where they have open and honest conversations about how they respect and value and embrace diversity, then ultimately the college can start to move to a more equitable and inclusive hiring plan. This plan will have to be supported by upper administration, and they will have to in turn work to get buy-in from faculty, staff, and students. However, if they are able to accomplish this, the institution will be better for having embraced this way of thinking, having developed a more diverse and inclusive faculty, and hopefully retaining a more diverse and inclusive group of students.